Okay, hi Tracy, here we are.
Yes, 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 yes.
I am really excited for this conversation. Let's introduce ourselves first before we introduce what we're here to talk about, because I think that we're going to share this with our communities. And so some of us know, some people watching might know me, some of them might know you. So let's just begin. Why don't you tell us who you are, what's your background, what perspectives do you bring with you?
Yes, and some people won't know either one of us because this is like timeless and right, spaceless. So my name is Tracy Brown. I am a licensed practitioner of religious science. I'm based in Dallas, Texas, and an active leader and volunteer at CSL Dallas. Outside of that, I am kind of, I don't know, I think of three things, three ways that people really know me. One is I have owned a business and built a business over the last few decades working on diversity and inclusion strategy and skills with organizations and associations all over the United States. And so Intentional Inclusion Incorporated is my life, is my work in the world. And so it made absolute natural, organic sense for me to want to do that work in spiritual communities. And I have done that for many years, but officially in 2009, I started a brand, Stained Glass Spirit, which focuses on inclusion in New Thought spiritual communities, although I've also done the work in evangelical Lutheran churches and United Methodist and Baptist and Catholic churches as well. And then the third piece is what is mine to do. A lot of people know me through that. I did a TEDx talk with that title. It led to a book. It led to a Facebook group that has over 7,000 members. And we ask ourselves the question every day, what is mine to do to interrupt or end race-based hatred and violence? Mm. So a lot of my life and my work is around inclusion, really. What's our strategy? How do we work together in ways that are successful in our multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-generational society? And related to all of that work, there have been a few books, and I love to speak and teach and roller skate. So people who know me well, I always put it in my introductions. If you know Tracy well, you know on Thursday night or Sunday night, you can probably find her in a skating rink.
Now that is something I did not know about you. I love that. Thank you, Tracy. I'm so honored and blessed to spend this time with you. And I just think you are such a blessing to our entire movement of Centers for Spiritual Living and really to the world. I really look up to you, and I'm thankful to have this time just to talk to you and also get to know you a little bit better.
So who are you?
So me, thanks for asking. I am Reverend Elisha Christopher. I am currently newly, the senior minister at the Center for Spiritual Living in Santa Cruz. I was one of the first recipients of the Regeneration Scholarship for Centers for Spiritual Living that elevates young people into ministry. And I am so incredibly blessed and feel so much gratitude and how privileged I am to have been able to receive that and be elevated by my community to be able to step into ministry and do this work at such a young age in my life. I feel like most ministers in our movement don't get to start till much later in their experience. And it's, I've been a practitioner since 2010, which is really, I've been a practitioner my entire adult life. And I realized what a special, unusual experience that is. And I find such a blessing in that. And this year at my center, we are engaging in a theme that we're calling our Year of Inner and Outer Permaculture. And we're using the principles of permaculture and sustainable agriculture in sort of pairing them with the principles of science of mind, of saying what, and really thinking of this as how do we design a pathway for ourselves and our society to help decolonize our thinking and really help build an actually truly thriving and diverse world. And so February, as we know, is Black History Month, and is in our community, the theme for the month, or the permaculture principle that we're going to be exploring, is use and value diversity. And that, something that's really been striking me about that particular theme is the and in the middle. That I think we live in this culture, this world that does one of the two often really well, right? Like we think of the history of America, like this nation is built on using diversity, but not valuing the people themselves. And I find myself in a lot of very mostly white spiritual communities that say we value diversity, and yet we're not using our connections, right? And so there's this bridge building that I think we need to, that I need to do, the work that I need to do personally. And I'm hoping to invite my community and others along with me. And so it kind of, to tap right back into your question and your work of what is mine to do, one of the things that's been emerging for me in the last couple years, really, and I think it's a conversation that's emerging nationally. But for me, that question of what's mine to do has been really on me. And in seeking that question, I'm finding a lot of blank spaces in my awareness. And, you know, we were talking a couple years ago at Asilomar, at our summer conference, and you had mentioned this body of work, the research that you had begun called the Hidden Legacy, recognizing that I know that in my education through science of mind, when I look at the lineage that I was taught that I'm part of, I see a whole bunch of rich white people who are sort of the people I'm descended from philosophically. And at some point, a year and a half or so ago, one of my congregants called me out and wrote me this wonderful email, reminding me and pointing out that, you know, as I teach and I speak and as I quote people and as I bring in the sort of big names and spiritual teachers, that almost everyone that I was quoting or referencing was white. And, you know, this whole what's mine to do conversation is really like, how do I fill in the gaps of what I don't know, right? And bringing awareness to myself and to my community. And so in our conversation and in this other conversation, I really started to recognize that I can't change the education that I've received up until now, but I can seek to educate myself moving forward.
Yes.
And I find that as a white male-bodied person, I feel like as I'm rising in my world of influence and have a ministry and have a platform, I feel that I have a responsibility to use my platform in the world to speak to what I feel is really important and be a voice for what is necessary. And so I think that brings us to why we're here today. Because I really am curious about learning a bit more about who I don't know about and who are some of the people who have really formed our movement and our philosophy. And I'll say one more thing and then I'll stop talking and let you talk, is that one more example of me realizing what I don't know is I was at East Bay Church of Religious Science in Oakland a number of years ago. I lived in Berkeley for a long time. And I remember being in the room and Reverend Eloise was preaching, and she referenced Mother Pearl and a couple other names. And every Black person in the room went, mm-hmm. And I went, huh? What don't I know? I'm missing something. There's secrets here that I am not privy to, right? And it was like, why is this missing in my education? And how come I don't know these people's names? And only recently have I taken it upon myself to try to learn who Mother Pearl was, Ernest Holmes's minister. You know, and so I'm excited to just dive in and hear a little bit about your experience of coming up in this philosophy and looking for the people who look like you, who were a huge piece of who we are and how we got here.
So I was smiling, almost laughing. And I have to say this like before I kind of dive in and pick up where you left off. So two things happened. One, you were talking right about, oh, and our theme this year is permaculture, and we're, you know, we're going to decolonize. And I'm like, see, this is why we need younger ministers. Because there are no old folks talking about permaculture and using the word decolonize in its appropriate use in a very comfortable, natural, organic way. It's like, oh, this is like, I'm so grateful for you, who you are, and for all of us to be exposed to like an expanded view and have exposures to new things. Because yeah, I had to go look up permaculture. What is that? So that was the first smile. And then the second was, as you mentioned, Asilomar, I was thinking, yeah, the first time I met you was not the recent Asilomar. It was Asilomar like, 10 or 11 years ago. And so I had to laugh because it never would have crossed my mind that, yes, because of your race and your gender, that you would just like, right, all the cycle of socialization, you're socialized like everyone else, like me and everyone else, that here are the people who are the leaders, here are the people you should know about, here are the people you should quote. And the reason that kind of hit me like this is because, well, let's put it this way. The very first time I met you, I was like, who is this weird guy? And he's dressed like this, and he looks like this, and he's a teen, of course, right? And so it's been beautiful over the last, 10 dozen years to see you really live the principles and challenge us as an organization in many, many ways along the way. So I'm delighted to have this conversation.
Thank you, Tracy.
And as I was going through all of the training, so I came into religious science in 1986. And I was exposed to a lot of the concepts, but I never really, even though I would visit the communities in Dallas, where I was living at the time, I was in a Unity church, and the senior minister at the Unity church was science of mind trained. So Dr. Donald Curtis was, trained in LA. He studied with Ernest and Fenwick Holmes, and he moved to New York. He was an actor. He moved to New York, and he studied under Raymond Charles Barker directly and was ordained there, and moved to Dallas later in life. And so I got, like the second generation, I got, that teaching. But it never felt, the communities never felt really welcoming to me, Unity or the religious science communities after he left Unity. And then I was exploring. And so I studied on my own for really 20 years, integrating the principles into my life, into the way I live my life, but not really being a part of a church or a center officially, just visiting, that kind of stuff. And part of what it was me being not even curious, me just assuming there were no people like me in the movement along the way. When I started getting really super involved in around 2007 or 8, and I started teaching some classes on areas of expertise, diversity, inclusion, conflict resolution. So this was way before I became a practitioner. I was like looking for resources and I couldn't find them. And then I did all the training and became a practitioner myself. And same thing. I was like, I know there's got to be somebody who's had an impact on this movement beside Michael Bernard Beckwith, who I love, admire, and respect. But I'm like, there is no way. So that's what got me started. Because in just even reading about or talking to people about Michael Beckwith, then the name Dan Morgan as Beckwith's teacher came up. And then there were a whole lot of people in Los Angeles who were trained around the time that Beckwith and Nirvana Gale and that Cynthia James, Deborah Johnson, all of them were being trained, but there were full generations of people ahead of them.
Yeah.
And so I started asking questions and it began to be like following the breadcrumbs.
Wow.
Who did you learn from? Who taught this? Who was involved in, who were their board members of Religious Science Institute? Or, you know, were there people along the way? And so all of these breadcrumbs I started collecting, finding out things that I couldn't believe were not in any class or any text. And so we could look at the 60s and 70s and 80s to now, and it begins to be gets a little easier. But even that, if you go outside of Los Angeles, it gets to be hard. So finding out beautiful tidbits like, oh no, there were Black ministers in Ohio. I mean, in the books, you don't even know there's religious science anywhere except the West Coast and New York City, right? So to find out that there were Black ministers in Ohio, ministers with an S on it, and that there was Garland and, well, that's like coming into the current contemporary or recently deceased, or to go in different parts of the country and see some of the growth, or to find out that Marcus Garvey, who was not a religious scientist, who was not a minister, but in the entire Garvey movement, one of the books he quoted the most was Faith in Action by Fenwick Holmes. Who knew? Or the reason that I thought Ralph Waldo Emerson had to be a Black man was because Garvey included a lot of the Emerson work around knowing yourself and every person being human in the Garveyism movement. And when I was growing up, a lot of the adults around me went out of their way to quote Black authors because they knew we were only getting white authors in school. And Ralph Emerson was quoted a lot. So he must be Black. You know, those kinds of things. And then one other thing, and then I'm gonna breathe. So that's like, if you go from the 60s forward, have dozens and dozens of people and references and ways that we in science of mind were engaged and involved in what was going on in the world. But let's go backward. Let's go back if Science of Mind was founded in 1927, and you know, if we think mid-20s as the beginning, and what happened in the 30s and what happened in the 40s and what happened in the 50s. there were Black people back then. Oh my God, can you believe it? So many people, many people have read about the experience with Arthur Twine and Third Church, and how the experience in the Science Mind magazine removed that church and put it at the end of the list instead of alphabetically, and labeled it as a colored church, or which was the language at the time. And that Ernest Holmes, when he found out, said, no, that's not acceptable, put it back in alphabetical order, and went to the church to explain that, no, this teaching applies to everyone equally. And it does not matter that this is a church that is multiracial, and that we won't have that. So that's an early statement. And that in 1937, Sarah Flowers, a Black practitioner, graduated from the professional program of the Institute of Religious Science, and then was a full-time practitioner. She had a weekly radio show. Ernest Holmes was not the only one. She had a weekly radio show. She wrote at least 6 books, and probably more, but at least 6 books that I've been able to find that she self-published.
Wow.
And then she wrote a series of pamphlets on different topics. Her book, The Atomic Principles of Man, is quantum physics. Before we were even using the term quantum physics, like I'm reading it going, this is good. I don't understand it all, but it's right.
Wow.
And she wrote a metaphysical thesaurus that was really widely distributed in the late 30s and early 40s. So it's like we can go back, and why we are not learning about people like this. And of course, that would then lead to Mother Pearl in the 40s and 50s and 60s. I don't know why. I don't place blame or shame, but like you, for me, it became, this is a legacy that's hidden, but it won't be hidden to me.
And won't be hidden because of you.
Yeah, when I was recently recognized with receiving the honorary doctorate from Centers for Spiritual Living, my reflections, of course, there's shock and there's surprise and there's delirious excitement, right? But when I got quiet and when I got still, the very first things that came up were all about, it's not just me. Like, this recognizes the seeds planted and the work and the commitment, the dedication of dozens, hundreds of people, who came before me, some of whom I know, and thousands who I don't know.
I think it's so important. It's our spiritual tradition, Science of Mind, is just over 100 and 150 years, I guess, maybe we're looking at. And it's a short enough time that we have the ability to trace our lineage, if you will, and I think it's really important for us to remember whose shoulders we're standing on, and whose work and whose minds and whose thinking has pushed us has brought us to where we are, and there was a point where I was really concerned, isn't the right word, but it was like, Ernest Holmes has this term race consciousness, right? Now I think we try to say collective consciousness. I think it's more true. But the education that I got kind of was a particular race's consciousness.
Yes.
You know, and I think sometimes about the evolution of science of mind and how our philosophy needs to evolve and adapt as we learn and grow as individuals, as a movement, and as a society. And I just had a thought. Where did it go? That in order for us to evolve forward, we need to look at the roots of who we really are, and not just one particular slice of the perspective. Because when I look at all of the names that I was taught, Phineas Parkhurst Quimby and Mary Baker Eddy, and these people, I kind of have this vision sometimes of science of mind coming to us from these like wealthy white people sitting on top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, looking out and telling the rest about how the world works. And does that trickle all the way down to the true experience of most people? Yes, this is how the universe works, but I think that there's a yes and a parenthesis and some dots and some exclamations and some asterisks and footnotes that are required to add on to this philosophy.
If this is the way it works, and if we are teaching universal spiritual principle, then that means it's working for and through a whole lot of people who we just haven't written down or recognized. And for me, I think that was one of the things, one of the things when I became aware of like the overlay of Garveyism and science mind principles, that principle by principle, you were really looking at the same thing. And so I'm not saying we should like change all of our history and say, oh, because Marcus Garvey was not, teaching religious science, but he was teaching some of these principles. And it's interesting to see the application of the principles in the world in so many ways. And even going back to, well, wait, let's look at the principles and where did they come from? So, Jiname, African Adinkra symbol, loose translation or literal translation, there would be nothing except for God. But part of a philosophy that says there is only one source of life, and it is God that has created all that is. That's an ancient African philosophy. And when you think about just geographically and the history of the development of the world, there are so many things we teach that actually go back to ancient African truths. So some of Buddhism and Hinduism actually came out of Africa. You have to think of what were the patterns of the development of societies. So let's really go back and integrate some of that in as well, because we are really comfortable referring to or integrating Buddhist practices, Hinduism. We'll go back in philosophy to Plato, and we'll go back in philosophy, to a certain point, as if that was original. Mm-hmm. When really much of it came from African truths as they migrated to different parts of the world. So we could go all the way back there, or we could be a little easier on ourselves and start in the mid 1800s as New Thought was really beginning to grow, and transcendentalism. And then how did that feed into? But Ernest Holmes told us I have not created anything new here. I have synthesized the golden thread, the common message, the common practice or principle that is underneath or permeates the major religions around the world. So we do have an opportunity, I think, in this generational period to say, oh, we really get that. Now let's make sure our history reflects that. So we're not changing science of mind.
Mm-hmm.
We're just capturing a better picture of where it came from and who has been involved along the way, which means we have to ask different people. So if we only ask, we've asked and relied a lot on people who knew Ernest Holmes personally. But when I was reading one of Sarah Flowers' books, she referred to one of her early teachers, whose name is not coming to me right this moment, but he was Indian, like from India, who was an actor, one of the few actors in Hollywood at the time, but he was also a religious scientist. Well, I had never seen his name in anything, but he was well recognized. And we know Ernest Holmes knew a lot of people in the film industry, and that religious science attracted a lot of people in the entertainment industry. But that's not a name I had ever heard.
Yeah.
Right? So I go look that up. I didn't know that Founders Church, which is now, that'd be 25 or 30 years in. I didn't know that Founders Church was designed and the construction was coordinated by an African-American architect. Why would I mean, is that important? Well, yeah, it's important to demonstrate that in our movement, here was this multi-million-dollar project in the late 50s, and our leaders chose a Black architect to do that work. That's not just important for me as a Black person to know. That's important for white people to know, to understand that action was taken. It was not some theoretical thing. Or let's go back 100 years before that and look at one of our influencers, Ralph Emerson. I didn't know that he wrote and actively lectured or spoke against slavery until I was doing some research to teach an Emerson class and found a book where some folks at Harvard had collected Ralph Emerson's anti-slavery writings. What?
How have I had multiple Emerson classes
and never hear that? And never hear his description. And it wasn't, so today we get people saying, oh, don't talk about what's going on, that's politics. No, he wrote about the reason that he was against slavery was he starts laying out the spiritual principles about all, and because he believed that, it didn't make sense for him to support slavery, that no human being can enslave others. And every part, I mean, yeah, obviously you can read what he wrote, but the fact that, yeah, you took multiple Emerson classes or classes where he was referred to and never once got assigned to read or research his anti-slavery writings. And it's not like he only gave one speech or lecture,
right?
because the book is like 300 pages.
Wow.
So how many people have we met have we missed along the way, whether they were people of color or they were people who were white, who were demonstrating our principles in an environment that may not have been easy for them to take that stand.
Wow. So there's a really interesting trajectory that I'm this like kind of story arc that I feel like I'm seeing here, which is that, you know, we just had our CSL convention last week, right? And I've been saying in the last couple of weeks, I've never been prouder to be in the last week. I've never been prouder to be a member of this organization, Centers for Spiritual Living, for what we're standing for the direction we're saying we're going, for who and for whose voices we're lifting up, for the there's a momentum that I see. We're moving in a direction that I feel like I didn't see for a long time. And the new thought religious science that I'm aware of in sort of the generation before me, if you will, 60s, 70s, sort of the last 50 years before now, seemed to be very, it's all about you, get your red car, your prince, your princess, your palace, your Porsche, your prosperity, whatever it is. And kind of a weakness or a unwillingness to really touch some of these really core issues. But what I'm hearing from you is that if we look back to the founding of this movement, our founders, some of the originators of this philosophy were actively working for the greater good, for the collective good, for recognizing the divinity in each individual soul of, you know, the organization in the 50s being able to choose, you know, the architect, and Emerson being very clearly against slavery. Like, if this is the founding of the movement, it seems like we went kind of away from our core for a while, and maybe we're starting to come back around.
Well, maybe, and you mentioned Mother Pearl earlier, and Mother Pearl, for those who have not been exposed to her, Pearl C. Wood founded Triangular Church in Los Angeles, and it actually was a very active church that then affiliated with religious science, and I don't know whether he went every Sunday, but he did visit that church on a regular basis on Sunday mornings, because as you remember, he did lectures in the afternoon. And so that was one of the churches that he visited on a regular basis. And and she was a Black woman, and her son-in-law then was on the board for religious science in the, you know, after he took over the church, he was also on the board. He was a practitioner, minister, a teacher for a long, long time. And then the leadership of the church went to her grandson, Gregory Pitts, for a couple of decades, and he has since retired. But you know, you got three generations, including serving in the organization, not just their individual church. And the reason that comes to mind is because when you talk about this kind of lineage and this trajectory, in the 1960s and early 70s, when there was so much going on with the civil rights movement, the teen groups, the adults who were leading the teen groups, when there were marches in Los Angeles, the religious science churches were there. The teens were there. Like, we watch and we're so proud of our teens being involved in pride marches and pride activities in different communities. Well, that was happening with people from a variety, like all the churches that had teen groups, right? All the teens would come and they would do marches because it was a way to demonstrate our teachings in action in the world. So I think the shift has shown itself in the 90s and the 2000s, right? From maybe the early 80s or mid 80s until recently, that for whatever reason, I do have a couple of theories about that, but I haven't done enough research to say them publicly yet. But it does seem like we kind of shifted away. And I think part of it is in our society as a whole, there was so much. And I've heard a lot of people who've been in our movement 20 or 30 years or more say things like, well, we just thought, especially around racism, we just thought all that got taken care of, like after the marches, after the civil rights legislation in the late 60s and after the mid 70s. And so in turning attention to the individual and forgetting that every individual is contributing to the collective consciousness and what is happening in society as a whole, that wasn't where we started. That's not where we are finding ourselves now, right? We're shifting to the both and. But I do think we've had easily 30 years of looking here. Like I'm just gonna look at the mirror, it's just me. Except in our communities where there have been a large population of people of color. They never turned away and they never could ignore it, because for many people, like you mentioned, East Bay, and for many of the communities that disaffiliated with CSL, that were predominantly Black or predominantly people of color, we've had dozens of communities disaffiliate because they felt they could not be seen or would not be listened to, and were taking the teachings in a way that excluded the reality of the lived experience of people of color. And we have a lot, we could keep doing that as a movement, but I don't think you or I or a few hundred people that you and I could name will allow that to happen.
Yeah.
And that the decolonization. So in my mind, I'm linking back to your earlier comments about permaculture and about decolonizing ourselves. It's our work to do, because that if we don't break the socialization, if we don't insert something new, if we don't fertilize the seed that is already there, then either it won't grow or no one will notice it as it's trying to break through the concrete. And that's that cycle, right? So we're in the cycle now of saying, no, wait, stop. There's this hidden legacy. Aren't you curious about it? Wouldn't you like to know about these people? They're your people too, even though they may not have the same skin color. And then we grow, we fertilize, and then we grow the next generation of what Science of Mind will look like.
Wow. I'm really excited to be alive at this moment in history, in our society, in our world, in our particular movement of New Thought. I feel like, we have this powerful vision of our world that works for everyone and all the sort of stuff that goes along with that. And as I look around sometimes, I feel like, we must be getting close, because everything unlike it is rising up. And it's like, a wound can't heal unless it festers. And all that icky, ugly stuff has to come up for us to look at and recognize that it's all part of the healing process, you know. And I love, again, someone at the conference last week, I think, said, you know, that we are, these questions, these conversations are having themselves, they're having their way with us. And we can either be part of the conversation or not. I can either be part of the conversation or not. And I'm just so grateful for this short, just little conversation, little bit of education for me, to just make one step in a direction, you know. And the thing that I am committed to for myself, and that I think is our work as a movement in New Thought, is cleaning up the cognitive dissonance between what we say we believe and how we actually show up in the world.
Yes, yes, yes. Amen. Ashe, aho. Yes. That
You know,
is it.
and I think that it's one conversation at a time, right?
And we don't have to be mad about it. And we don't have to be shaming people about it. Let's just be excited about opening some doors, uncovering some information, including it in classes going forward, which is what we teach, right? We teach, you don't keep looking back because you just keep bringing more of that. Let's make a choice that we're going to do this, and then we move forward. We don't have to beat anybody up. We don't have to label people as racist or hateful or any of that. They did what they did. They shared what they've shared. And now it's up to us to learn what we learn and to teach what we teach.
Yeah. This will be my final thought, and I'll let you, if you have any final thoughts. There's a woman whose name I'm forgetting right now, and I feel bad about that. I watched an article on her on the news a number of weeks ago, and she was the first African-American park ranger in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. And she is in her 90s now, and she's still actively serving. And she's doing her work as in doing the diversity, equity, inclusion work in the Park Service and in San Francisco. And there's one thing that she said that has just been continuously cycling around in my mind, that it was like, oh, this is my charge. And she says, my job is simply to fill in the gaps for people that I come into contact with. To just help fill in the gaps. And I feel like that's part of what this conversation has been about, is you're helping me fill in some of the gaps in my education and in my awareness. And that's what I'm seeking to do for myself, is just continue to try to fill in the gaps and get a greater, more complete picture of who I am, who we are, and where we want to go.
That's beautiful. And I had seen articles about the woman you're talking about, but literally just last week, someone gave me a book about her. So that is the only reason that I'm able to say her name is Betty Reed Soskin.
Thank you.
But I knew who you were talking about, but literally someone put her book, or the book about her, in my hand last week. And I think we have that in our movement as well. We have the Sarah Flowers, you know, we have the Mother Pearl, we have the June Cobb or the Dan Morgan. We have a long list of people who I'm learning about, who we all can learn about, and who we can then really see that we're continuing a legacy. And we are creating that together. That's what I want. But I'll be honest, I will say this, whether or not we create a new legacy together, I know that for me, my sanity and my ability even to engage in this movement, I and many other people of color, and definitely the majority of people who are Black, we needed to know and need to know that we are not invisible. And so I can be in this movement, and even if you don't know, like, I have to know. I have to know there were people before me who walked through doors that felt closed. And none of us want to have communities where people don't see themselves or don't feel welcome or valued. And I think this is one of the ways that we can, all of us, learn to be more open, more welcoming. And I can't even think of the word right now because we use so many words that don't reflect or don't match our behavior. But if I had to choose only one or two words, I would say our commitment must be to be the physical representation of oneness, to be the physical representation of unity. And you can't do that if you don't know anyone who's not like you.
Wow.
So thank you for inviting me into this conversation. My energy is like, oh, so happy. If you could see my energy, it would be like fireworks right now.
It's beautiful. Thank you, Tracy, for helping me fill in the gaps for myself. And I really do feel that it is important, not just for you and for people who look like you, but I think it's also important for me and people who look like me to get the full picture of the beauty and the brilliance of the diversity from which we come, because I think that is the magnificence of the divine that we know, is that multiplicity is part of oneness. And I am grateful to just be in conversation with you and to be in this together. So thank you, Tracy.